I still remember the exact moment I felt my heart crack and the air vanish from my lungs. It wasn't when I got the call telling me I'd been let go from a position I'd held for nearly 2 decades, though that was its own special kind of agony. It wasn't when the bills started piling up, or even when I realized I might not be able to pay for my own medications if I didn't figure something out soon. It was the instant my son looked me in the eyes, his gaze cold, distant, and laced with what I could only describe as utter disappointment, and told me that he wanted me out of his house. I stood there in the living room we'd shared for years, the same one where I had once comforted him through the flu, bandaged his scraped knees, and sang him lullabies. My world slowed to a standstill, and every memory of raising him washed over me like a tidal wave, leaving behind a briny residue of disbelief and betrayal that clung to my thoughts and made my skin crawl with shame. I tried to speak, but my lips quivered, and no sound emerged except a weak rasp of protest. I wanted to remind him that when his father left us, I was the one who worked day and night to keep this roof over his head. I wanted to explain that losing my job at 58 wasn't a moral failing or a sign of laziness. It was a cruel twist of corporate downsizing, the result of an economy that prized the new and cheap over the loyal and experienced. But as I stood there, pressed down by years of fatigue and heartbreak, I realized none of that mattered to him anymore. He had grown into a man who held the mortgage in his name, who believed his actions were justified, and who barely saw me as a person worth defending. I felt my eyes burn with tears I was too proud to let fall. He was my son, and the only word he had for me was out. "Please pack up, find somewhere else, and make it quick." He said it so calmly, like he was describing a piece of mail that had arrived with the wrong address. I heard something snap inside me, yet on the surface, I remained so heartbreakingly polite. All I managed was a muttered apology and a promise to leave as soon as I could. The front door shut behind me a few minutes later, though that moment remains blurred by the sting of tears that had finally found their way out. I walked down the porch steps in a haze, the midday sun making no impression on me. I wondered if the neighbors had seen or heard. How many times had I shown up on their doorsteps with a welcoming casserole or a friendly greeting? Now here I was, trudging away from the place I once called home, carrying a small suitcase of my essentials and a lifetime of regrets. Maybe I should have insisted on a stronger relationship with him all those years ago. Maybe I should have noticed how he'd grown distant, how he'd been steadily building a wall of resentment behind the facade of a successful, confident young man. Maybe I should have realized that my unwavering support had turned into a kind of background noise in his life. I let these thoughts swirl as I made my way to a nearby motel, the cheapest I could find, half an hour away by bus. The ride was uncomfortable, jostling me against strangers who were absorbed in their phones or daydreams. Through the dusty window, I watched suburban streets roll by. Houses with fresh paint, lawn sprinklers, the faint sound of children playing outside. All the while I felt as though the entire world had shrunk into an echo chamber that repeated my son's words, "You need to go." I wanted to scream, to cry, to call someone, anyone, who could help me process this. But I knew there was no one else in the family willing to take me in. My daughter lived out of state, married to a man who always looked at me like I was a burden, even when I had a steady income. My ex-husband was a lost cause, drifting in and out of states I couldn't track, never paying child support, never showing up on birthdays or graduations. No siblings, no close cousins, no one except a few acquaintances who had their own families to worry about. I had no illusions. I was on my own. The motel's neon sign flickered ominously as I checked in. The woman at the front desk tried to be friendly, but I barely managed a polite smile in return. The room itself was so cramped and drab that I wanted to turn around and leave the moment I smelled the stale air, thick with a hint of old cigarettes masked by cheap disinfectant. But it was the best I could afford at that moment. I set my suitcase in the corner and collapsed on the bed, ignoring the questionable stains on the comforter. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together how I had come to this. I had once been proud, resourceful, and even admired at work. My boss had trusted me to oversee entire projects, handle finances, manage staff. I'd been the glue that held so many details together. And then, one day, the company announced cutbacks. My position, along with dozens of others, was deemed non-essential. Just like that, my steady paycheck vanished, and so did the identity I had carved out for myself over the years. I kept telling myself it was a temporary glitch. I'd find a new job. I'd bounce back. But employers took one look at my age or my employment history and turned me away. Overqualified, they said. Possibly set in my ways, they might have thought. I felt powerless and unseen, and yet I clung to hope that, at the very least, my son would stand by me while I gathered my bearings. How naive I was. He had offered to let me stay in his home until I got back on my feet. But that generosity melted away the moment my severance pay ran dry, and the utility bills started ballooning. A few nights before the final blow, we had our last real conversation. He told me he was worried I'd never move out, that I was draining the resources he needed for his future. I tried to reassure him that I was looking for work, that I had interviews lined up. But as I spoke, I could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe me. Or maybe he just didn't care. And now here I was, lying on a stiff bed in a motel far from everything familiar, feeling like I'd been shattered into 1,000 pieces. When night fell, I finally dug out my phone and scrolled through my contacts, pondering if I should call my daughter. But I couldn't bear the thought of hearing the quiet judgment or pity in her voice. And so, in the end, I just cried silently into the pillow, letting wave after wave of humiliation and sorrow pass over me until sleep finally claimed me in the early hours of the morning. I woke up with a stiff neck and an even stiffer sense of determination that something had to change. I refused to let this be the last chapter of my life. I might have been battered, my pride cracked, but I wasn't broken. I still had fight left in me. So I forced myself to stand, take a shower in the cramped, water-stained bathroom, and dress in the only professional outfit I'd thought to pack. I made calls all day. To local businesses, to old colleagues, to any lead that might offer part-time work or even freelance gigs. My phone battery drained twice, and I had to recharge it using the outdated outlet near the nightstand that hissed every time I plugged something in. The more calls I made, the more rejections I heard. It was demoralizing to the point that by the evening, I had to bite my lip to keep from sobbing every time someone said, "We'll keep your resume on file." But a small voice inside me kept urging, "Keep going. Keep trying. Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you crumble." Because, despite everything, there was a spark of defiance burning inside my chest, stoked by the anger and hurt of being tossed aside by my own child. That night, I decided I couldn't stay at the motel much longer. My meager savings were dwindling, and the daily rate was too high to sustain. I had to think outside the box. That's when a fleeting thought surfaced in my tired mind. The mortgage. His mortgage. I knew it intimately because, until recently, I'd been quietly helping make the payments, providing extra whenever he fell short. He might not have known the details, but I had. Those monthly statements came to the house, and I often wrote checks in his name just to keep things running smoothly. The irony was striking. I had invested in his financial stability, only to be tossed out the moment my contribution wasn't enough. As I lay in bed that second night, insomnia gnawing at my nerves, I found myself thinking about how finances could be used in my favor. It wasn't a clean or noble thought, but I couldn't stop the idea once it sparked. If he was so eager to get rid of me, could I use his reliance on that mortgage to reconfigure my own living situation? It was a wild notion, one born of desperation, but it hung there, refusing to let me ignore it. In the morning, I packed my bags and checked out of the motel. I had to move fast. I knew if I lingered too long in that dismal little room, I'd fall into despair again, and that wasn't an option. Clutching my suitcase in one hand and my phone in the other, I hopped on a bus to the small downtown district, hoping to find a quiet corner in a cafe where I could figure out my next steps. I ordered the cheapest cup of coffee, found a seat by a dusty window, and opened my phone's browser. I started researching properties, lenders, anything that might give me an edge. My mind whirled with fragments of conversations from years past, my ex-husband talking about real estate, a coworker who once flipped houses, a friendly realtor I'd met at a community function. Could I pull off something that would allow me to live near my son while making a point he'd never forget? The bitterness of the coffee matched the bitterness in my mouth as I kept scrolling. I felt half-crazed, like I was grasping at straws, but the more I read, the more feasible the plan became. I didn't have the money to outright buy a property, but I knew about the equity in my son's mortgage. Thanks to my consistent contributions before losing my job, that mortgage had built up a decent chunk of equity. Furthermore, I had some retirement funds I could tap into, meager though they were, if I played my cards right. I found a listing for a modest house in the same neighborhood where I'd lived. It was smaller, a bit rundown, but it was literally next door, 2 houses to the left of the home I'd once called mine. The price was relatively affordable because it required some renovations. My heart pounded as I realized the unspoken promise of that property. I could live right under his nose. I would no longer be hidden away in a shabby motel or begging for a couch to sleep on. With the right financing, I could secure it. And I would use every ounce of knowledge I had from those mortgage documents to make sure I ended up with a monthly payment far more stable than he ever imagined. My mind reeled with the boldness of the plan. It was part revenge, part survival tactic. I hated that it had come to this. But the humiliation and betrayal throbbed like an open wound, fueling an anger that I couldn't fully quell. For years, I had sacrificed for my children, especially for my son, believing that our bond was sacred. Now, it seemed money and convenience had replaced loyalty and love. If I was going to salvage any dignity, I had to find a way to stand on my own, and if doing so next door to him was the only path, then so be it. I spent hours that afternoon making calls, reaching out to lenders, explaining my situation in vague terms. When they asked about my employment status, I had to navigate carefully, expressing my intent to secure new work soon while emphasizing my retirement funds and savings. The ones who weren't immediately put off by my shaky circumstances started discussing interest rates, down payments, and monthly obligations. My stomach churned with anxiety, but also with a stubborn excitement. This might actually work. That evening, I took the bus to a different motel, slightly cheaper, and repeated the routine of researching properties and lenders. It was nerve-wracking. I felt like a con artist, spinning the best possible version of myself to these financial institutions, while in reality, I was a middle-aged, newly unemployed woman with heartbreak written all over her face. But desperation can sharpen resolve like nothing else, and in those moments, my sadness was overshadowed by a raw determination to reclaim my life. The days blurred together as I pursued this plan. The house next door remained my primary target, but I also looked at other listings, just to keep my options open. The idea of living a few feet away from my son was both terrifying and enthralling. Terrifying because I couldn't imagine his reaction when he realized what I'd done. Enthralling because it felt like a small piece of poetic justice. Late one night, after a string of discouraging phone calls, I found myself curled up on the motel bed, my phone clutched in my hand as though it were a lifeline. My thoughts drifted to the day my son was born, how small and fragile he was in my arms. I remembered swearing to protect him at all costs, to give him the best life possible. How ironic that now, decades later, I was protecting myself from his cruelty. My heart ached with nostalgia, but also with a profound sense of betrayal. Had I failed him as a mother, or had he failed me as a son? Perhaps both. The next morning, I got a call from a lender who sounded cautiously optimistic. He said the deal was unusual, but not impossible, especially if I could put down a reasonable portion from my retirement account. I nearly jumped for joy, but I kept my voice measured, professional. Inside, though, I was a jumble of nerves and excitement. By the end of that week, I had a handshake agreement, subject to final paperwork and an inspection of the property. It felt surreal. The agent who was selling the house had no idea of the history between me and the place 2 doors down. She simply thought I was another late-stage buyer looking to downsize. I nodded through her polite small talk, feigning a gentle interest in the property's square footage and the age of its water heater, while my mind roiled with thoughts of how my son would react. Every so often, I had these pangs of guilt, wondering if I was stooping too low or letting bitterness guide my actions. But every time that guilt surfaced, I recalled how calmly he had told me to leave, as though I was an unwanted piece of furniture. And then I'd remember the decades of love and sacrifice I gave him, only to be discarded. My guilt would transform back into cold resolve, fueling me for another day of phone calls and contract negotiations. As the purchase moved forward, I realized I would need a place to stay until the closing date. My meager funds were running dangerously low. I reached out to a friend who lived an hour away, a woman I used to volunteer with at a local shelter. She had a small guest room, no bigger than a closet, but she offered it to me for free for a couple of weeks. I swallowed my pride and accepted with gratitude. Living out of a friend's cramped space brought its own set of indignities, but at least I wasn't draining my savings on motel fees. In the rare moments of quiet, I'd think about what life would be like once I moved into that house. Could I fix it up myself? I pictured fresh paint, new curtains, maybe a small garden in the backyard. More importantly, how would my son react when he realized I was so close by? The thought made me uneasy. Would he pretend not to know me, or would he confront me with anger? A quiet part of me almost hoped he would come knocking on my door, demanding an explanation, so I could lay bare all the resentment, the hurt, and the heartbreak he'd caused me. But another part of me wanted peace, to simply live my life in quiet dignity, proving I could survive without him. Time dragged on, yet the closing date finally arrived. I dressed in my best outfit, the same one I'd worn to job interviews that never yielded a callback. I took a shaky breath and signed every document the realtor placed before me. My hand trembled as I wrote my name again and again, each signature feeling like a mix of victory and trepidation. In under an hour, I was handed a small folder with the keys to what was now my home. My home. The realtor congratulated me with a bright smile, and I forced one in return, though my heart felt too heavy and too full to be neatly contained by a single expression. As I left the office, the weight of it all sank in. I had done it. I had become a homeowner again, in a manner that was as defiant as it was desperate. The house was mine, but so was the responsibility, the monthly payments, and the uncertain future. I promised myself I wouldn't run from it. This was my chance to rebuild my life on my own terms, to assert my independence and my worth. I arrived at the property in the late afternoon. The paint was peeling, the lawn overgrown, and there was a slight musty smell when I opened the front door. But it was mine. I carried in a single suitcase, the same one I'd left with when I was forced out. The sun slanted through the dusty windows, illuminating the worn wooden floors. I stood there for a long moment, letting the reality wash over me. This wasn't going to be easy. The house needed work, and I still needed a job. But I felt a curious lightness in my chest, as though in this neglected space, there was a freedom I hadn't felt in years. I breathed in, ignoring the stale odor, focusing instead on the sense of possibility. I walked to the window, which offered a partial view of the street. If I craned my neck just right, I could glimpse my son's place a couple of doors down. A swirl of emotions took hold of me: anger, sadness, longing, pride. I wondered if he even realized what had happened. Had he seen the moving truck that brought a few of my old things from a storage unit? Had he glanced out his window when a battered sedan dropped off my boxes? The idea that he might be oblivious to my presence both annoyed and relieved me. I ended up sleeping on a sleeping bag that first night. I had no furniture except a foldable chair I'd borrowed from my friend. The silence was eerie, broken only by the creaks of an old house settling into the night. But I felt an odd sense of comfort in that quiet. Perhaps because no one could tell me to leave. In the following days, I found a sense of purpose in cleaning and making minor repairs. It was physically exhausting, especially given my age, but with every wipe of a dusty surface and every nail I hammered back into place, I felt my spirits lift just a notch. Neighbors walked by, peering curiously at the older woman bent over a bucket of soapy water, scrubbing the front steps. A few waved politely, and I waved back. I recognized some faces from my old life, but they showed no sign of recognizing me. Either I'd changed more than I realized, or they were too immersed in their own affairs to recall. It stung a little, but at least it gave me a sense of anonymity. I wanted to choose my own moment to reveal myself to my son, if I decided to reveal it at all. One morning, I ventured out to buy groceries, carefully selecting items that were cheap but reasonably nourishing. My funds were still tight, and while I was waiting on some job applications, I had no immediate paycheck in sight. I passed by the street that led to his house, our old house, and paused. Should I walk by, see if he was around, gauge his reaction? The temptation was strong, but something held me back. I wasn't ready to face him, not yet. My pride was still raw, and I wanted to meet him on equal footing, not as a mother begging for acknowledgement, but as a neighbor with her own life, her own finances, her own power. So I trudged on, groceries in hand, the weight of them a reminder that every step I took was now solely my responsibility. That night, as I was sorting through old photos, most of which were of my children, I felt a surge of bittersweet nostalgia. There was one photo in particular, my son, around 7 years old, perched on my lap in front of a Christmas tree. His eyes sparkled with excitement and love, and my smile was broad and genuine. I traced a fingertip over the outline of his face, recalling the warmth of his small body curled up against mine. How had we gone from that moment to this new reality, where bitterness and self-interest overshadowed any semblance of family loyalty? The question stabbed at my heart, but no clear answer emerged. I tucked the photo into a box, deciding it was too painful to display, at least for now. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, I learned the rhythms of my new neighborhood. The couple across the street walked their 2 dogs every morning, always wearing matching windbreakers. The older woman next door sometimes sat on her porch knitting, glancing at me with mild curiosity whenever I hauled out a trash bag full of yard waste. Little by little, I began to feel less like a stranger in my own life. Then, one late afternoon, I was elbow-deep in scrubbing the kitchen floor when a movement outside caught my eye. I glanced up through the window and saw my son's car rolling past, coming to a stop 2 doors down. My breath caught in my throat. He emerged from the driver's seat, wearing a crisp shirt and slacks, his hair carefully styled. I felt a pang of conflicting emotions, pride that he looked so put together, and anger that he'd turned his back on me. I watched from behind the glass, my heart pounding. He opened the trunk and pulled out a grocery bag, then disappeared into the house I once considered home. I just stood there for a moment, frozen in place, water dripping from my rubber gloves. The reality that I now lived steps away from him sent a jolt through my system. I could feel my pulse beating in my ears, and my mind began spinning scenarios of how he might react if he saw me. Would he be surprised? Furious? Remorseful? Or would he simply pretend I didn't exist? My hands trembled as I removed the gloves and took a few steadying breaths. Later that evening, I found the courage to step outside. I didn't walk in front of his house. Instead, I went around the back alley to deposit some boxes in the trash. But even from there, I could see the warm glow of his living room lights through a window. It occurred to me that he might still be telling friends or family that I chose to leave, or that I was traveling, or something equally dismissive. I wondered if he even felt a trace of guilt or regret. I had no answer, just a swirling pit of hurt in my stomach that made me feel both hollow and weighed down. Determined not to let this define my every waking moment, I threw myself into searching for employment. I expanded my hunt to part-time roles, consulting gigs, anything that could bring in money. I wasn't above cashier work or stocking shelves. After weeks of repeated rejections, I finally caught a break. A small accounting firm needed a part-time bookkeeper, someone to reconcile invoices and handle data entry. It was far from glamorous, and the pay was modest, but I seized the opportunity. The manager, an older gentleman, seemed sympathetic to my situation, though I only offered the barest details. The relief I felt upon receiving a job offer was almost overwhelming. It meant I could keep paying my mortgage and maybe save a little to fix up the house. I started the following Monday. The work was repetitive and sometimes tedious, but there was comfort in routine and in knowing that each hour I toiled put more distance between me and my precarious circumstances. In the evenings, I'd return to my quiet little house and make a simple meal: rice, beans, maybe some vegetables if I could afford them. Then I'd set about cleaning or painting a wall, gradually making the space feel more like a home. One evening, I decided to tackle the backyard. The overgrowth was dense, with tangled weeds and old branches that threatened to take over the small plot of land. I worked until the sun dipped below the horizon, sweat pouring down my face, my arms aching from the strain of tugging stubborn roots out of the ground. As I took a moment to catch my breath, leaning on my rake, I heard voices from the other side of the fence. It was my son's backyard. His voice was unmistakable, and he was speaking to someone, maybe a friend or a neighbor. The fence was too high for me to see over without climbing something, but I could hear laughter, casual chatter. My heart twisted at the sound of his familiar tone, remembering how he used to come home from school bursting with stories to share, all told in that same voice, only younger, more innocent. Now he spoke with a confidence tinged by a hardness I didn't recall from his childhood. My hand tightened on the rake, and tears burned at the corners of my eyes, but I forced them back. I reminded myself that I was here by choice and necessity, that I had a life of my own to build. I wouldn't let his presence unravel me. Over the next few days, I heard him again from time to time, distant echoes of conversation drifting through the air whenever we were both outside. We still hadn't come face to face, and a strange tension settled around the neighborhood, at least in my mind. I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, checking my surroundings whenever I stepped out the door. Then it happened. One Saturday morning, as I was unloading a couple of small furniture pieces from a friend's truck, I saw him walk by on the sidewalk. He froze, eyes widening when he recognized me. I braced myself, my stomach plummeting. For a moment, he just stared, blinking rapidly as if trying to process the surreal sight of me standing there, in the driveway of this old, neglected house next door. Then his face hardened. "Mom," he said, the words sharp like a blade. I swallowed, my mouth gone dry. "Hello," I managed, my voice unexpectedly calm. He looked at the furniture I was dragging inside, then at the house, then back at me. What are you doing here?" His confusion and anger were palpable. My heart hammered, but I forced my shoulders to remain squared. "I live here now," I replied, gesturing toward the open door. His eyes narrowed. "You live here?" He glanced toward his own house, the realization dawning. "Since when? Why?" I took a deep breath. I had rehearsed this conversation in my mind 100 times, but none of those rehearsals captured the raw tension of the moment. "I bought this house," I said simply. "Needed a place to stay after you, asked me to leave." The muscle in his jaw twitched. For a second, I thought he might yell or storm off. Instead, he just shook his head, disbelief mingling with anger. "You bought this place? How in the world did you afford that?" I shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "I had some resources. Retirement funds. And I'm working part-time now." We locked eyes. Silence stretched between us, thick with all the unspoken accusations and hurts. I could see questions simmering behind his gaze, but he seemed too stunned to form them. Finally, he just muttered, "Unbelievable," and walked away, the tension in his stiff shoulders visible even from a distance. I stood there, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands shook as I resumed carrying the small coffee table inside. The adrenaline rush left me lightheaded, and I sank onto the floor the moment the door shut behind me, pressing my forehead against my knees to steady myself. Part of me wanted to chase after him, to demand he acknowledge the pain he'd put me through. Another part of me felt guilty for the satisfaction I took in his shock. In the end, I stayed put, letting the moment pass, letting him walk away. Word began to spread among the neighbors that I was his mother, though I don't know who started the rumor. Maybe someone recognized me, maybe my son told someone in exasperation. Regardless, I noticed a subtle shift in how people looked at me. A mixture of curiosity and mild pity. None of them asked me directly about the situation, but I could see the questions in their eyes when they offered polite greetings or forced small talk. I maintained my dignity with a polite smile and a quick change of subject. My life was complicated enough without sharing the details of my betrayal with half the street. My new routine settled into something resembling normalcy. Wake up early, go to the bookkeeping job, come home in the late afternoon, fix a simple meal, then spend a few hours improving the house or browsing online for better job opportunities. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of my son. Sometimes he'd drive by and glance my way, other times I'd see him from my window when he took the trash out. We barely acknowledged each other, our interactions reduced to stiff nods or averted gazes. Yet beneath that cold distance, I sensed a storm brewing. Both of us were too proud, too hurt, to be the first to extend an olive branch or demand accountability. As weeks turned into a couple of months, I slowly transformed the house. The peeling paint on the exterior was replaced with a fresh, soft gray. Inside, I repainted the walls in warm, muted colors, replaced the old curtains with ones I found on clearance. I even planted a few flowers in the front yard, their bright blossoms a stubborn declaration that beauty could flourish in neglected spaces. Each improvement felt like a tiny victory, a reminder that I was capable of building a new life from the rubble. However, not everything was rosy. The mortgage payments were steep, and my part-time gig barely covered the bills. I had to dip into my dwindling savings more often than I liked. Despite the satisfaction I found in making the house livable, I couldn't ignore the creeping anxiety that whispered, "What if you can't keep up? What if you lose everything again?" My shoulders grew tense with the weight of those questions, my sleep restless as I struggled to figure out a more stable solution. Then one evening, as I was reviewing my finances at the worn dining table, I heard a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. No one visited me unannounced. Maybe it was my neighbor with a friendly inquiry, or perhaps someone wanting to sell me lawn services. But when I swung open the door, I found myself face to face with my son. He looked tired, maybe even remorseful, but there was a rigid set to his jaw that told me he hadn't come to offer any heartfelt apologies. My pulse quickened as I stepped aside to let him in, unsure of what to expect. He hesitated in the doorway, scanning the living room. It was the first time he'd been inside since I'd moved in. His eyes flicked across the freshly painted walls and the modest furniture. "So you really did it," he said, voice strained. "Bought this place?" I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Yes." He took a few steps forward, rubbing his hand over the back of his neck. "Why?" It was such a simple question, but laced with so much complexity. I took a deep breath, deciding I had nothing to lose by being honest. Because I had nowhere else to go. And because I wanted to be close to what used to be my home. Even if I can't live there anymore. His face clouded. "You had options. You could have moved in with someone else, or moved somewhere cheaper." "I didn't," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. "This is what I chose." Silence stretched between us. Eventually, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to say. This is weird. It's like you're trying to make a statement or punish me." I felt my anger spark. "Punish you? Maybe I just wanted a roof over my head. A place I could afford, thanks to the equity I helped build in your house." His head snapped up. "What are you talking about?" I folded my arms. "I paid those mortgages for years, you know. Helped you out whenever you were short. You might have held the official loan, but I poured thousands into that place." He stared at me, disbelief warring with guilt in his eyes. "I never asked you to do that." The words stung. "You never asked, but you certainly never refused. And you sure as hell enjoyed the benefits. Then the minute I lost my job and couldn't keep up, you decided I was dead weight." His cheeks flushed, and he looked away. "It wasn't like that, Mom. I was in a tough spot. I needed to make sure I could handle my own future. I can't just take care of you forever." My stomach turned at the callousness of that statement. "I wasn't asking you to take care of me forever. I was asking for a little compassion while I tried to find my footing." He didn't respond, and in the quiet, I could hear both our hearts pounding. The tension was thick, an almost tangible presence in the room. Finally, he mumbled, "So what now? You're just going to stay here, right next door, acting like everything's fine?" I resisted the urge to raise my voice. "I'm just going to live my life. If you have a problem with that, it's your problem, not mine." He opened his mouth as if to argue, then snapped it shut, exhaling sharply through his nose. "Unbelievable," he muttered again, his favorite word for this whole situation. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked out the door, leaving it ajar behind him. I stood there for a long moment, trying to steady my breathing, to calm the tumult of emotions swirling inside me. When I finally closed the door, I locked it and rested my forehead against the cool wood, letting out a shaky breath. That conversation could have gone better or worse. At least now, everything was on the table. He knew why I was here, and I knew where he stood. Still, my heart felt like it had been through a grinder. As days turned into weeks again, our interactions remained strained. Sometimes I'd catch him glaring at me if we both happened to be outside at the same time. Other times, I'd hear from a neighbor that he was complaining about crazy family drama. I tried to remain above it, focusing on my work and my slow house improvements. Yet the emotional weight was draining. Every time I saw him, I was reminded that my own child had lost respect for me, that he saw me as a burden or an adversary. It felt grotesque and unnatural, like we had reversed roles in some twisted story where the child punishes the parent for being weak. Then, one evening, I received a letter in the mail that nearly caused my heart to stop. It was from the mortgage company that held his loan, not mine. I recognized the insignia immediately. My hands shook as I tore open the envelope, wondering if he was defaulting, if somehow my own finances would be tangled in the mess. The letter was a notice of late payments. I felt my stomach drop. He was missing payments on his mortgage. Immediately, my mind flooded with questions and memories. When I lived with him, I always made sure those payments were on time, even if I had to pitch in more than I could really afford. Now that I was gone, apparently he was slipping. My initial reaction was a surge of schadenfreude, the bitter satisfaction of seeing him stumble without me. But as the reality sunk in, I realized that if he lost his house, I'd be stuck living next door to a foreclosure, which would tank my own property value and possibly drag me into further financial peril. Another sick twist of irony, my financial security was still partially tied to his responsibility. It felt like a cosmic joke I couldn't escape. I debated whether to confront him about it. Part of me argued that it wasn't my concern anymore. Let him deal with the consequences of his choices. Another part of me couldn't ignore the potential fallout. My precarious situation didn't need any more turmoil. After wrestling with my thoughts all night, I decided to approach him. The next afternoon, I waited until I saw his car parked in his driveway. My heart hammered as I walked to his door, rehearsing what I'd say. But when I rang the bell, no one answered. I rang twice more, each time hearing faint movement inside. Finally, I gave up and walked back to my house, a knot of anxiety forming in my chest. Later that evening, I saw him taking out the trash. I hurried outside, catching him by the sidewalk. "You missed some mortgage payments," I said, trying not to sound accusatory. He stiffened, his brow furrowing. "How do you know that?" I held up the letter. It came to my address by mistake, probably because I used to handle some of the paperwork. His eyes darted to the envelope in my hand, then away. A mixture of shame and anger flashed across his face. So what if I did? I exhaled slowly, trying to stay calm. If the bank forecloses, it's going to hurt both of us in the long run. You lose your home, and I deal with the fallout next door. He scoffed, tossing the trash bag into the bin with more force than necessary. That's not my problem. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stifle it. It might not be your problem, but it will be your reality. Unless you figure out a way to get current on those payments. His mouth set in a tight line. "It's none of your business, Mom." "It is my business if it affects me," I retorted, my voice edged with frustration. "You told me to get out, and I did. But you can't just bury your head in the sand about your finances and expect it won't impact anyone else." He glared at me, eyes flashing with resentment. "Fine. I'll handle it, okay? Just back off." He marched toward his house, leaving me standing by the curb, enveloped in the stench of garbage and the sting of his words. That night, I lay awake, tortured by an internal debate. Should I just let him fail? Let him learn his lesson the hard way? Or should I try to offer help, risking more rejection? After all, despite everything, he was my son. I couldn't entirely shut off the maternal instinct to protect him, even if he'd made it abundantly clear he didn't want me around. The next morning, an idea formed. I'd already found a small amount of success with the bookkeeping job. Perhaps I could offer my services to him, strictly professional, strictly about finances. Maybe I could help him reorganize his budget or negotiate with the mortgage company. It wouldn't be personal charity, just a practical arrangement. But how would I propose it to him without triggering his temper? The opportunity arrived a few days later when I spotted him mowing his front lawn. I approached cautiously, waiting at a respectable distance until he shut off the mower. He eyed me warily. "What?" he asked. I swallowed my pride and spoke calmly. "I have experience in budgeting and bookkeeping. I'd be willing to look at your finances and see if there's a way to catch up on the mortgage and stabilize things. I won't give you money, but I can give you my expertise." He let out a humorless laugh. "You really think you can fix my life?" "No. I'm offering to help you fix it," I corrected, keeping my voice steady. "It's up to you. You can say no." He stared at me for a long moment, the sound of a neighbor's dog barking in the distance the only interruption. Finally, he ran a hand through his hair. "Why would you even do that for me? After everything?" I hesitated, struggling to find the words. "Because, despite it all, I'm your mother. And because it benefits me too if you keep your house afloat. But mostly, I don't want to see you ruin your life over pride." His expression softened, if only slightly. He looked down at the handle of the mower, as if ashamed to meet my gaze. "Fine," he muttered. "But this doesn't change anything between us." My heart sank at his cold statement, but I nodded. "Understood." We agreed to meet in a neutral space, my small dining room table, later that week. The morning of our meeting, I felt a swirl of anxiety and resignation. I prepared a pot of coffee, laid out some notepads, and set up my laptop. When he knocked, the tension was nearly suffocating. He entered without removing his shoes, his posture rigid. I gestured for him to sit, and we began to go through his finances. The numbers were grim. He was behind on not just the mortgage, but also credit card bills and a small personal loan. As he explained how it had gotten so out of control, I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to scold him or say "I told you so." Instead, I methodically listed his debts, his income, his expenses. I showed him how he could prioritize payments, consolidate some debts if possible, and negotiate with the mortgage lender for a modified payment plan. He listened with a mixture of guilt, frustration, and grudging respect. I could tell he resented needing my help, yet he also recognized he was in over his head. When we finally finished, he slumped back in the chair, exhausted. "So, basically, I have to live on a shoestring budget and hope the lender is willing to work with me." "For a while, yes," I said gently. "It won't be forever, but until you get out of this hole, that's the reality." He rubbed his eyes, looking more vulnerable than I'd seen him in years. "Thanks," he mumbled, almost too softly for me to hear. I nodded, swallowing back a wave of emotional turmoil. Part of me wanted to hug him, to say it's going to be okay. We'll figure this out. But I knew that was no longer the dynamic between us. We were neighbors and financial collaborators of convenience now, not a loving parent-child unit. Instead of hugging him, I handed him a folder with organized documents. "You can reach out to the lender with this information. Let me know if you need anything else." He gave a stiff nod, then stood and walked to the door. Just before leaving, he paused. "You've changed," he said quietly. "You're different." "So are you," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. He left without another word, and I sank into the chair, drained. That day marked a tentative truce of sorts. He stopped glaring at me whenever we crossed paths, and I stopped resenting his presence as much. We weren't friendly by any stretch, but the hostility lessened. Occasionally, he'd text me a question about a bill or ask if I knew a good contact for insurance. I'd respond with the information he needed, nothing more. Weeks passed, and he began to get his finances under control, thanks to a partial refinance and some cutbacks. I heard from a neighbor that he'd taken on a second job, working some weekend shifts to make up the shortfall. The news brought me a strange mix of pride and sorrow, reminding me of how hard I had once worked for the sake of our family. One morning, as I was tending to my newly planted flowers, I caught a glimpse of him leaving for work. Our eyes met, and this time, I saw something like gratitude there, albeit faint. He gave me a slight nod before climbing into his car. I returned it, feeling a subtle warmth spread through my chest. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about how far we'd come from the day he coldly told me to leave. That night, as I prepared a simple dinner, I found myself thinking about what forgiveness might look like for both of us. Could we ever return to a place of genuine love and respect? Or had that bridge been burned too thoroughly? I didn't have an answer, but I felt a glimmer of hope that, given enough time, maybe we could salvage something. Yet the wounds were still fresh, and I knew that healing would require effort and honesty from both sides. In the meantime, I continued my slow march toward rebuilding my own life. I searched for better job opportunities, occasionally interviewing for full-time roles that would utilize my years of experience. Rejection was still common, but the difference now was that I had a home to come back to, a space that was truly mine. Even if it stood in the shadow of a painful past, it also symbolized my resilience and my refusal to be cast aside. The house was gradually becoming more comfortable. I'd saved enough to buy a decent sofa, and a friend helped me refinish the floors in the living room. My modest attempts at decorating felt empowering, each little touch a reminder that I could create beauty and stability even after being betrayed by those I loved. I still had sleepless nights where I'd stare at the ceiling, haunted by the memory of my son's ultimatum and the hollowness it left in my heart. But each morning, I found myself a bit stronger, a bit more willing to believe that my life wasn't over. If anything, it was entering a new phase, one where I wasn't just a mother or a discarded employee, but a person reclaiming her worth on her own terms. Not all was peaceful. There were occasional flare-ups of tension between us. He'd complain about something trivial, like the noise of my repairs or the placement of my trash bins. I'd shoot back a sharp retort, fueled by old wounds. But those moments passed more quickly now, overshadowed by our mutual acknowledgement of the uneasy balance we shared. We were, in a twisted sense, forced to coexist. The real test came when an unexpected family event pulled us both into the same space under more traditional circumstances. My daughter announced she was visiting for a weekend, and since she hadn't spoken to me much during my period of homelessness, I braced for another emotional onslaught. She texted me that she wanted to see me, and I hesitantly offered my home. She agreed, though I could sense hesitation in her voice messages. The day she arrived, I was stunned to see her car pull up in front of both houses. She got out, looking around with an expression that registered mild shock. "Mom?" she called tentatively, before noticing me standing on my porch. I waved her over. She rushed up the steps and enveloped me in a hug. I felt tears prick my eyes, and for a moment, all the burdens eased. We went inside, and she took in the modest furnishings, the walls I'd lovingly painted. "You've done a lot with the place," she remarked, a hint of awe in her voice. I nodded, offering her a seat. She sat, fidgeting with her purse strap. "So, you live right next to?" "Yes," I said flatly, anticipating her reaction. She let out a low whistle. "Wow, that must be awkward." I forced a tight smile. "You could say that." She hesitated, glancing at the door as if expecting him to barge in at any moment. "Have you two even talked about everything?" I shrugged. "Somewhat. We're civil now, barely." She shook her head, disbelief written all over her face. "I can't believe he did that to you. Kicking you out like that. We haven't spoken much lately, but if we do, it's strained. He's always been proud, but this," she trailed off, and I could see tears gathering in her eyes. She wiped them away, clearing her throat. "I'm sorry I didn't offer to take you in. My husband was not keen on the idea. But that's no excuse." I reached for her hand, giving it a squeeze. "I understand. Really, I do. Life is complicated." She nodded, visibly relieved I wasn't holding a grudge against her. We spent the rest of the day catching up. She told me about her job, her new place out of state, her future plans. I shared the bare bones of how I managed to buy this house. The conversation was tinged with caution, as though we were both afraid to set off another emotional mine. That evening, we decided to go for a walk around the block. Just as we stepped outside, we saw my son pull up to his driveway, stepping out of his car with a weary expression. He froze upon seeing his sister. For a moment, I thought she might yell at him or storm over. But she just stood there, arms folded, eyes glinting with unresolved anger. He approached tentatively, offering a stiff greeting. She responded with a curt nod. I held my breath, uncertain if this would escalate into a shouting match. Instead, my daughter said, "I'm visiting Mom. Mind if we talk later?" He looked at her, then at me, then back at her. "Sure," he muttered. "I'll be around." We continued our walk, the tension palpable, but there was a sense of mutual respect in the air. Later that night, after my daughter had gone to her motel, I stared at the dark silhouette of my son's house from my window. A swirl of thoughts consumed me, our fractured relationships, our attempts at rebuilding, the complicated dance of resentment and love. Despite the pain, I felt the faint flicker of hope that maybe we were inching towards something that resembled healing. When my daughter left the next day, she hugged me tight. "Take care of yourself, Mom," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And if you ever really need me, call. I'll try to make it happen, okay?" I nodded, tears slipping down my cheeks. "I will, sweetheart." "Thank you." She glanced once more at her brother's house, then got in her car and drove off, leaving me with the quiet hum of possibility. In the days that followed, my son seemed subdued. He didn't mention his conversation with his sister, but I noticed he wasn't as tense around me. The financial strategies we'd set in motion appeared to be working. He no longer risked foreclosure, though he was still strapped for cash. As for me, I was scraping by, but stable enough to avoid panic. One afternoon, as I was sweeping my front porch, he walked by on the sidewalk. I half expected him to hurry past, but instead, he stopped. "How's the house coming along?" he asked, in a tone that wasn't overtly hostile. I lowered my broom, surprised by the question. "It's getting there. Needs some more work in the basement, but I'll handle it eventually." He nodded. "If you need help, I've got some tools." It was a simple offer, one that might seem inconsequential to someone else, but to me, it was monumental. I studied his face, searching for signs of sarcasm or pity. I found none. Just a tired, guarded sincerity. "Thanks," I said softly. "I appreciate that." He gave me a curt nod and continued walking. I stood there, heart beating a little faster, wondering if that brief exchange was the start of something resembling a truce, or even a fresh foundation. Over the next few weeks, we found small, careful moments of cooperation. He loaned me a drill set so I could fix some shelving. I helped him fill out paperwork for a refinance offer. Neither of us apologized outright for the past, but we stepped cautiously around it, like it was a bruise too tender to touch yet. My anger and hurt didn't evaporate, nor did his defensiveness, but we were forging a fragile connection built on practical needs and cautious respect. Then came a day I'll never forget. I was weeding my front yard when I glanced over and saw him standing on his porch, looking at me with an inscrutable expression. I paused, squinting against the sun. He raised a hand in a tentative wave. I waved back. He stepped down from the porch and crossed the strip of grass that separated our driveways. My pulse quickened. "Hey," he said, hovering awkwardly at the edge of my yard. "Got a minute?" I nodded, dusting off my hands on my jeans. He exhaled slowly, looking anywhere but at my face. "Look, I know things have been complicated, and I'm not great at this stuff, but..." He hesitated, clearing his throat. "I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. I shouldn't have kicked you out like that. It was selfish and I guess I was scared about my own future. But that doesn't excuse what I did." My eyes stung with tears, but I kept my voice steady. "Thank you for saying that." He shuffled his feet. "And thanks for helping me with the mortgage stuff. I'd probably be out on the street without your advice." I blinked back tears, swallowing the knot in my throat. "You're welcome." He glanced over his shoulder, perhaps worried a neighbor might see this vulnerable moment. "I'm not saying everything's perfect now, but I'd like to try and be better." His words, though halting, felt like a balm on a deep wound. I managed a small smile. "I'd like that too." We stood there, neither of us sure how to proceed. Eventually, he broke the silence with a small chuckle. "So, do you have time later to maybe go over some budgeting spreadsheets again?" I nodded, wiping my cheek hastily. "Yeah, absolutely. He returned to his porch, and I went back to my weeding, but my heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. Maybe we'd never be the same mother and son we once were. Maybe we'd always have the memory of that betrayal between us. But in that moment, I sensed that we were forging a new bond, one shaped by hardship, regret, and an unexpected second chance. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in many months, I felt something like genuine hope take root in my chest. And as I knelt among the flowers, carefully tugging out the weeds, I realized that sometimes the most painful separations can lead us to unexpected places, places where we discover our strength, our capacity for forgiveness, and the power of rebuilding a life on our own terms, even if it's just a few feet away from the very people who once broke us.